What if one of the most dangerous angels in history, an entity whose name once struck terror in the heavens, was originally recorded in the opening chapters of Genesis, and then deliberately erased? Picture it. A parchment older than empires, inked by the trembling hand of a scribe who had been entrusted with the earliest memories of mankind. The text begins with familiar lines, "In the beginning." Yet just beyond those words lies a presence that does not belong to the light. His name was there, etched in the sacred story like a shadow beneath the sun. And then, at some point in history, someone made a decision. That name would vanish. His deeds would be folded into vague phrases and fleeting hints, leaving only the faintest trace for future generations to stumble upon. The Genesis we hold today gives us a few cryptic lines: sons of God taking daughters of men, giants walking the earth, violence filling every corner. But these lines are like smoke without the fire. They tell us something happened, but not who ignited it, nor why it nearly consumed the world. For centuries, theologians have debated those verses, often choosing to leave them in the realm of mystery rather than face the unsettling possibility that Scripture once named a leader among the fallen watchers. And that leader was not Satan as we think of him, but another, an angel commander with his own dark command, his own rebellion woven into the very fabric of human history. In the shadows of forgotten libraries, a different story survived. The Book of Jubilees, preserved in the ancient canon of the Ethiopian church, whispers his name, Mastema, not just another rebel, but the orchestrator of corruption before the flood, the accuser who tested the faith of Abraham, the unseen hand stirring chaos through the generations of Israel. His presence is so consistent, so targeted, that to read Jubilees is to watch the war of heaven and earth unfold with chilling clarity. And that is the question we must ask. Why would such a figure be removed from the text that shaped the spiritual imagination of half the world? Was it to protect the faithful from fear? Or was it to shield the faith itself from a narrative too complex, too dangerous, too revealing? Today, we set out to restore this missing thread. We will walk the thin line between what Genesis tells us and what it refuses to say. We will listen for the voice erased from the sacred record, the whisper that once echoed in the earliest telling of our story. And as we trace his shadow from Eden's aftermath to the trials of the patriarchs, we will confront a possibility that could change the way you read the Bible forever. That there was more than one great adversary at work from the beginning, and one of them has been hiding in plain sight. Genesis 6:1-4 is one of the most haunting fragments in the entire Bible. It reads almost like a riddle carved into the stone of history, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. 4 verses. That's all we're given. No names, no details, no motives, just a flash of something otherworldly, terrifying, and utterly foreign to the rest of the narrative. The text moves on as if nothing happened, as if this brief, almost casual mention of divine beings crossing boundaries, siring giants, And corrupting humanity is not the very hinge on which the story of the flood turns. If you've ever read Genesis straight through, the shift feels abrupt. One moment we're reading about the descendants of Adam. The next, we're being told that heaven and earth have mingled in a way they were never meant to. And then, nothing. No explanation of who these sons of God were. No account of their leader. No record of the council in heaven where this breach began. It is like walking into the aftermath of a great battle and finding only the smoke. Never the armies that fought. Why the silence? Some say it's because the original audience already knew these stories from oral tradition, that Genesis did not need to explain what everyone already understood. Others suggest that the scribes, under divine guidance or human caution, deliberately kept the accounts sparse to keep Israel's focus on the Creator, not the rebels. But what if there is another reason? What if the name of the instigator was once there and was struck out? The absence becomes even more striking when we remember how the Bible treats the adversary elsewhere. Satan is named, Pharaoh is named, Nebuchadnezzar is named, even lesser enemies, Moabites, Amalekites, Philistines are named and remembered. Yet here, in the story of the greatest moral collapse before the flood, the mastermind remains faceless. It's a gap so large it almost demands to be filled. Outside Genesis, other ancient texts step in to do exactly that. The Book of Enoch, fragments from Qumran, and most vividly, the Book of Jubilees all speak of a leader among the watchers. In Jubilees, he is not a shadow but a commander, a negotiator with God, a persistent enemy who moves through centuries of human history with a singular goal: to corrupt, to accuse, to destroy. His name is Mastema. And here's the unsettling thought: if the biblical authors of Genesis knew of him, but later editors removed him, then the version we hold today is not the whole story. It is a pared-down account, one where the enemy's identity has been swallowed by the fog of time. The unexplained gap in Genesis is not just a missing name, it is a missing context. Without it, the events before the flood appear as a vague moral decline. With it, they become part of an epic war, one in which heaven's own messengers crossed the line into rebellion, and humanity became the battlefield. In the next chapter, we'll step beyond that gap and into the world of the Book of Jubilees, a world where the smoke clears, the armies are visible, and the commander of the fallen stands in full view. If Genesis gives us only a silhouette in the mist, the Book of Jubilees throws open the curtains to reveal the entire figure. Preserved for centuries in the highlands of Ethiopia, hidden from most of the Western world, Jubilees claims to be no mere retelling of Genesis. It is, in its own words, a revelation given to Moses on Mount Sinai by a heavenly messenger. The angel did not just narrate the history of creation and the patriarchs, he read it directly from the tablets of heaven, an unalterable record of everything that had happened and everything that would come to pass. The tone of Jubilees is different from the Bible most people know. It moves with the same milestones as Genesis creation: Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood. But where Genesis is sparse, Jubilees is dense, deliberate, and unapologetically detailed. It pauses to explain why the seasons are set as they are, why festivals exist, why laws were given long before Sinai, and most relevant to our search, who was truly behind the corruption of mankind before the flood. And here, in plain language, we meet him, Mastema. Unlike the shadowy sons of God in Genesis, Mastema is named, given agency, and allowed to speak. He is not depicted as an abstract force of evil, nor as the supreme adversary we know as Satan. Rather, he is a high-ranking angel who leads a faction of watchers in open rebellion against the order of heaven. He commands spirits, bargains with God, and seeks permission to test the faith of men. The way Jubilees frames him is chilling. He is not a mindless destroyer. He is a strategist, a manipulator, a figure who can blend petition with defiance in the same breath. The book does not soften his crimes. Before the flood, Mastema's watchers take wives from the daughters of men, producing giants whose violence nearly tears the world apart. After the flood, when God binds most of the rebellious spirits, Mastema pleads to retain a fraction of them, 1/10, to continue afflicting and misleading humanity. And, in a decision that both shocks and fascinates, God allows it. The war is not over. It is permitted to continue within certain bounds. Why does this matter? Because in Jubilees, the story of humanity is not merely about men and their choices. It is about a long, grinding conflict between divine orders, with Mastema as a recurring antagonist who appears in generation after generation. When Abraham rises to prominence, Mastema is there to challenge him. When Moses confronts Pharaoh, Mastema is there to harden hearts and stir resistance. His shadow stretches far beyond the flood, weaving through the entire arc of redemptive history. If Genesis offers us a silent battlefield, Jubilees hands us the battle map, the troop movements, and the name of the general on the opposing side. And yet, here is the mystery. While the Ethiopian canon still contains this book, the wider Christian world does not. The name Mastema is absent from the Bibles that most believers hold in their hands. His presence has been confined to the realm of apocrypha, footnotes, and academic circles. And with that absence, a key part of the narrative, the identity of the enemy in those earliest days, has slipped beneath the surface of mainstream faith. In the next chapter, we will draw this figure into sharper focus. We will examine the portrait Jubilees paints of Mastema not as an idea, but as a living, speaking being who commands the watchers. And we will ask what it means for the history of heaven and earth if such a being once stood openly in the pages of Genesis. In the Book of Jubilees, Mastema steps out of the shadows with a clarity that Genesis never offers. His name, in ancient Hebrew, carries a weight of meaning, hatred, hostility, enmity. He is not simply one of the fallen, he is the embodiment of opposition. Yet unlike the chaotic evil we might expect, Mastema is disturbingly calculated. He moves through the pages of history like a chess master, anticipating the moves of heaven and countering them with precision. When the Watchers descend, those heavenly beings tasked with guarding the boundaries between the divine and the human, it is Mastema who emerges as their leader. Under his command, they abandon their stations, take wives from among the daughters of men, and father children of extraordinary size and strength, the Nephilim. These offspring are not merely large, they are destructive, dominating the earth with violence, their appetites devouring both the land and the people. In Genesis, this era of terror is compressed into a few verses. In Jubilees, Mastema's hand is evident everywhere. The text paints him as both a rebel and a litigator. He does not act without cunning. He approaches God, not with open defiance, but with petitions that are almost legal in tone. After the flood, when the other fallen spirits are bound, Mastema pleads, "Let some of them remain before me, and let them hearken to my voice, and do all that I shall say to them. For if some of them are not left to me, I shall not be able to execute the power of my will on the sons of men." It is a request that chills the blood. He is asking for the right to continue corrupting, to maintain a foothold in the human story. And in one of the most haunting moments in Jubilees, God grants him 1/10 of the Spirit's permission to afflict, to test, to tempt. It is not an unconditional surrender. It is a calculated allowance, a reminder that the battlefield of human hearts remains active by divine design. But Mastema is not merely content to corrupt humanity from the shadows. He intervenes directly in the lives of the patriarchs. When Abraham's faith reaches its pinnacle, Mastema appears in the heavenly court to demand a trial by fire, the sacrifice of Isaac. When Moses stands before Pharaoh, Mastema hardens the king's heart, fueling the resistance against God's people. In each generation, his presence is like a dark counterpoint to God's covenant promises, a force that seeks to twist destiny into disaster. It is this recurring role spanning centuries that makes Mastema's erasure from Genesis so striking. Without his name, the reader sees only isolated moments of evil and temptation. With his name, the pattern emerges, a sustained, organized campaign against the purposes of God, carried out not by a diffuse evil, but by a commander with a mission. And yet, Jubilees does not present him as invincible. His requests must be granted. His actions are allowed only within limits. He is a rebel under restraint, a reminder that even the most dangerous adversary moves within the boundaries set by the Creator. Still, for those who read Jubilees, the message is clear. The war between light and darkness is not a distant abstraction. It is personal, it is ancient, and it has a name. In the next chapter, we will watch that war erupt in its most violent form. Mastema's orchestration of the pre-flood world's corruption, the event that would bring the entire human race to the brink of annihilation. Long before the first drop of rain fell from the skies of Noah's day, the world was already drowning in corruption, violence, and fear. And at the heart of it all stood Mastema. Jubilees makes it plain the chaos before the flood was no accident, no slow decay of human morality. It was a campaign planned, executed, and sustained by a commander who understood that the surest way to destroy what God loved was to defile it from within. The plan began with the Watchers. In heaven's order, these beings were guardians, appointed to watch over the earth and its inhabitants, to protect the harmony between the seen and unseen realms. But Mastema, driven by enmity, whispered another mission into their hearts: leave your stations, take what is not yours, and raise up a generation that will dominate all others. And so they descended. The language of Jubilees spares no detail. These were not mere visitations, but an invasion, an incursion into the human story. The Watchers took wives from the daughters of men, crossing a boundary never meant to be crossed. Their union brought forth the Nephilim giants of immense strength and ferocity, whose very existence was a living defiance of heaven's design. the Nephilim became the terror of the earth. They devoured livestock, seized lands, and turned their hands to bloodshed. Their reign was not the rule of kings, but the oppression of predators. Where they walked, cities emptied. Where they camped, the ground grew barren. The violence that Genesis mentions in passing the earth was filled with violence is in Jubilees, the direct fruit of Mastema's rebellion. But Mastema's ambition reached beyond brute force. Corruption was his true weapon. Under his influence, humanity abandoned the laws given to their forefathers. They worshipped the spirits of the fallen, built altars to the watchers, and embraced sorcery, idolatry, and blood sacrifice. The image of God in mankind was being marred, twisted into the image of their new masters. And heaven took notice. In Jubilees, the angels who remained faithful bring their complaint before God. The destruction is too great, the infection too deep. Humanity, left unchecked, will vanish into darkness. It is then that the judgment is pronounced. The earth will be washed clean. For Mastema, the coming flood was a counter-strike, but he was not finished. Even as God prepared to cleanse the world, Mastema sought to preserve his influence. He would bargain for the survival of a remnant of his spirits, to continue the war on the other side of the waters. The seeds of that negotiation would be planted before the ark was even built. In the next chapter, we will watch this adversary step into one of the most sacred moments in the life of a patriarch, twisting a test of faith into a theater of accusation. As Mastema demands the trial of Abraham, the flood had come and gone. The giants were gone, their bodies buried beneath mud and memory. But Mastema was still here. His tenth of the spirits still roamed the earth, whispering, tempting, and stirring rebellion in human hearts. And as the generations passed, his eyes fixed on a single man, a man whose faith and obedience threatened to undo centuries of his work. His name was Abraham. Abraham was not just another wandering herdsman in the eyes of heaven. He was the seed from which an entire nation, God's own covenant people, would grow. Every promise God made to Abraham was a nail in the coffin of Mastema's designs. If this man succeeded, if his descendants clung to their God, Mastema's influence would face its greatest challenge yet. And so the commander of the fallen prepared his most audacious move. In the Book of Jubilees, the scene is stark. Mastema approaches the heavenly court, not with sword in hand, but with words sharpened like arrows. He accuses Abraham before God, echoing the same strategy that Satan would later use against Job. Test him, Mastema demands. Prove his loyalty. Strip away the blessing and see if he still obeys. And so the command comes, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and offer him as a sacrifice. The text in Genesis presents this as a direct word from God. Jubilees adds another layer, that it was Mastema's petition, his challenge, that sparked the trial. The thought chills the mind. The most intimate test of Abraham's faith may have been the result of an enemy's dare. Imagine the moment. The old man rises before dawn, his face drawn, his eyes shadowed with unspoken grief. Isaac walks beside him, carrying the wood of his own sacrifice, unaware of the weight it represents. And somewhere beyond the sight of human eyes, Mastema watches, waiting for the moment when Abraham's resolve might crack, when faith might falter, and the promise might shatter. But the breaking never comes. With the knife poised above the altar, the voice of God intervenes. "Lay not your hand upon the lad, for now I know that you fear God." Mastema's plan fails. His challenge has been met with unflinching obedience. Yet, even in defeat, the adversary's influence is not erased. Jubilees records other moments, subtler, quieter, where Mastema stirs opposition to Abraham's descendants, sowing distrust and hostility among the nations they encounter. If he could not stop the covenant at its root, he would seek to choke it as it grew. This is the pattern of Mastema's warfare: bold strikes at the turning points of history, followed by years of persistent undermining. And as the covenant family multiplied in Egypt, he prepared once more to step into the story, this time to stand in the way of a deliverer named Moses. In the next chapter, we will follow Mastema into the corridors of Pharaoh's palace, where the freedom of an entire nation hangs in the balance. If the flood had been Mastema's first great setback, and Abraham's triumph his second, the Exodus would be his next battlefield. For here was a moment that threatened to undo centuries of his work. In one sweeping act of deliverance, the liberation of an entire people from slavery, their return to the land promised by God. If Israel left Egypt free and faithful, they would become a living testimony of God's power, an anchor for the covenant in the sight of all nations. Mastema could not allow it to happen without a fight. The Book of Jubilees records that it was Mastema who stirred Pharaoh's heart to defiance, while Genesis and Exodus tell us that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Jubilees lifts the curtain to reveal another layer: Mastema whispering in the darkness, amplifying Pharaoh's pride, feeding his suspicion of Moses, and ensuring that every plague only deepened his resolve. Pharaoh was not merely resisting Moses, he was being played like a harp by the commander of the fallen. Mastema's interference wasn't limited to Egypt's throne room. Jubilees suggests that he unleashed his spirits against the Israelites themselves, seeking to sow fear and despair among them even as miracles unfolded around them. In the Red Sea crossing, in the long nights of the wilderness, in the hunger and thirst that tested their patience, his influence lingered like a shadow on their journey. Every complaint, every murmur of distrust was another opening for him to weaken their faith. But Mastema's reach extended beyond the Exodus. The history of Israel is marked by repeated cycles of rebellion, idolatry, and foreign oppression. And while human choices play their part, Jubilees implies that Mastema's hand was never far from the scene, guiding enemies to attack at just the right moment, tempting kings to abandon God's law, whispering lies to prophets who would speak in the Lord's name falsely. Even the great victories of Israel came with the subtle counterstroke of Mastema's strategies. When David united the kingdom, Mastema worked to stir division that would one day split it. When prophets called the people back to righteousness, he inspired rival voices to drown them out. His warfare was long, patient, and relentless. The power of this portrayal is not in depicting a supervillain who dominates every scene, but in showing an adversary who weaves his influence through the fabric of history, always present, rarely named. Remove his name from the record, as Genesis does, and the story becomes a sequence of human triumphs and failures. Keep his name, as Jubilees does, and the picture sharpens into an epic struggle between the covenant and the commander sworn to break it. But there is a lingering question, one that can't be ignored. Why would such a figure, so deeply entwined in the earliest chapters of redemption history, vanish from the most widely read version of the story. In the next chapter, we will confront the unsettling possibilities and explore the reasons his name and deeds may have been erased from Genesis. The question hangs like a sword over everything we have uncovered if Mastema truly stood at the center of humanity's earliest spiritual battles. Why does Genesis, the foundational book of the Bible, leave him unnamed? There are several possibilities, each as unsettling as the next. Theological caution. One explanation is that the ancient scribes sought to keep the focus on God's sovereignty, not on the powers of darkness. Naming Mastema might have risked elevating him in the minds of the people, giving the adversary undue weight in the sacred narrative. The early faith of Israel was forged in the shadow of pagan nations that openly named and worshipped their gods and spirits, some of them frighteningly similar to Mastema in power and reputation. By omitting his name, the scribes may have sought to draw a clear line. Israel's God is the center of the story, not the rebel angels. Doctrinal simplification. The Genesis we know was not just a historical record, it was a teaching text for generations who would recite it aloud, memorize it, and pass it down. A straightforward narrative of humanity's moral decline before the flood was simpler to teach than a complex account involving celestial hierarchies, heavenly courts, and angelic politics. Removing Mastema's name stripped away the intricacies of the rebellion and left only the moral takeaway: humanity sinned, God judged, and the righteous survived. Protecting the faithful from fear. We should not underestimate the psychological weight of such a name. For the average believer in the ancient world living without the protections of modern law, surrounded by idol worship, sorcery, and unpredictable nature, the knowledge of a named active adversary leading a host of malevolent spirits could provoke crippling fear. A faceless evil is easier to resist than a clearly defined one with an ancient pedigree and an unbroken record of attacks against God's people. Editorial decisions in the transmission of Scripture. It is also possible, perhaps likely, that as the Scriptures passed through centuries of copying, editing, and translation, certain details were streamlined or removed to align with the emerging theological consensus. If Mastema was seen as a figure overlapping with Satan, his name might have been erased to merge the adversary's identity into one singular figure. Or, if the community compiling the canon considered Jubilees unreliable, they might have purged Genesis of any details that would support it. But whatever the reason, the effect is the same. The enemy's name is gone, his story fragmented, and his role left to the margins of apocryphal texts. And yet, traces remain 4 verses in Genesis 6, scattered warnings about sons of God and giants, and the unexplained persistence of evil even after decisive divine judgment. This omission changes the way we read the earliest chapters of the Bible. Without Mastema, the story of the flood and the patriarchs is framed as a purely human saga. With him, it becomes something else entirely, a record of an ancient war whose battles span both heaven and earth. In the next chapter, we will attempt to restore the full picture, reweaving Genesis and Jubilees into a single tapestry that reveals the scale, strategy, and stakes of this hidden conflict. To read Genesis alone is to glimpse a battlefield after the smoke has cleared, shattered remnants of a fight, but no clear sense of how it began or who commanded the armies. To read Jubilees alongside it is to see the entire campaign unfold, from the first whispers of rebellion to the decisive strikes that shaped the course of human history. When we stitch the two accounts together, a larger, more vivid picture emerges. Genesis gives us the setting, a good creation, corrupted by violence and moral decay, leading to divine judgment. Jubilees supplies the missing actors and motives Mastema, leading the watchers in a calculated breach of heaven's order, sowing both physical and spiritual ruin. In this restored narrative, the flood is not simply a moral cleansing, it is a military strike. God's judgment is aimed not just at wicked humanity, but at the hybrid dominion Mastema engineered, the Nephilim, born of an unholy alliance between angels and women, ruling the earth through terror. Their destruction is as much about breaking a power structure as it is about punishing sin. The pattern continues after the flood. Genesis tells us humanity spreads and nations are formed. Jubilees shows Mastema negotiating to retain a fraction of his forces, ensuring the conflict will continue. Genesis moves swiftly to the calling of Abraham. Jubilees reveals that this calling unfolds under the constant threat of sabotage from the same adversary. Even the pivotal stories, Abraham's test, the Exodus, the wilderness wanderings, shift in tone when Mastema's role is restored. What were once seen as isolated acts of human weakness now appear as coordinated attempts by an ancient enemy to derail God's covenant plan. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart is not only divine orchestration, it is also the whisper of a dark strategist fanning the flames of pride. The murmuring in the wilderness is not mere ingratitude, it is the slow drip of discouragement from a persistent foe. The restored picture also sharpens the stakes. Without Mastema, evil is diffuse and impersonal. With him, it becomes targeted, intelligent, and relentless. The war is not a vague struggle between good and bad impulses. It is a campaign waged by a named commander against the purposes of God, with humanity as the contested ground. This perspective reframes the reader's role as well. We are not passive observers of a long-gone struggle. We are inheritors of a war that still shapes our world. The same enemy who tempted the watchers, who tested Abraham, who opposed Moses, remains active, though under divine limits. His story in Jubilees is not just ancient history, it is a dossier on the methods and motives of a spiritual adversary who still wages war today. And so, restoring the picture is not about adding drama to an old story, it is about recovering the intelligence we have lost. Without it, we walk into the battlefield unaware of the commander who opposes us. With it, we see the contours of the fight, the history of the enemy, and the unbroken chain of God's counterstrikes. In the final chapter, we will bring the journey to a close, summarizing what has been uncovered, confronting the implications for how we read Genesis, and inviting you to wrestle with the question if this story is true. What will you do with it? We began with a whisper, a suggestion that Genesis might once have named a figure whose shadow stretches across the earliest chapters of human history. As we followed that whisper through the fragments of Genesis and the fuller account in the Book of Jubilees, the outline sharpened into the form of Mastema, a commander of the fallen, a strategist of corruption, a relentless adversary to the covenant of God. What we have uncovered is not a small footnote in the biblical story. It is a missing layer of context that changes how we see everything from the flood to the Exodus. With Mastema restored to the narrative, the events of early scripture are no longer isolated moral failures or chance rebellions. They are moves in a coordinated war, waged over millennia, with humanity as the battlefield and the purposes of God as the ultimate prize. If the erasure was intentional, the reasons, whether theological caution, doctrinal simplification, or the desire to protect the faithful, cannot erase the reality that ancient believers knew this name and understood his role. The Ethiopian tradition still preserves it. The Western canon does not. But absence from our common Bible does not mean absence from the story itself. And this is where the question turns to us. If Mastema's hand can be traced from the watchers before the flood to the testing of Abraham, from the hardening of Pharaoh's heart to the constant undermining of Israel's faith, then his absence in Genesis is not a safe omission, it is a blind spot. Wars are not won by ignoring the enemy's name. What do we do with this knowledge? Do we tuck it away as an intriguing piece of ancient trivia, or do we allow it to sharpen our reading of Scripture? Do we resist the urge to sanitize the story and instead embrace the uncomfortable truth that our faith has always been forged in the heat of conflict, not just against human weakness, but against spiritual intelligence that works to oppose God's plan? I invite you to wrestle with these questions. Imagine Genesis as it might have been, with Mastema's name spoken aloud in the opening acts of our story. Would it change the way you see the floodwaters rising? Would it alter your reading of Abraham's test or Moses' defiance before Pharaoh? The journey does not end here. This is only one thread in a tapestry of hidden history's threads that weave through Enoch, Qumran, and Revelation itself. The war we have glimpsed in these pages still shapes the world around us, and the same commander of the covenant who answered Mastema in the days of Noah and Abraham still calls his people to stand. So now, the question comes to you. If this story is true, if the missing name of Genesis belongs to the architect of some of history's greatest spiritual battles, how will it change the way you read, believe, and live? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this story. Challenge someone else to see Genesis with new eyes. And join us next time as we follow another hidden trail, one that may lead us deeper into the laws of Adam, the ancient calendar of heaven, or the prophecies of the end. Because the war is still on, and the pages are still turning,